Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Charity Radio. Hope everybody's keeping safe and well. So delighted to have this morning in our virtual studio, we have Professor Jim Lucey. Jim is the Clinical Professor of Psychiatry in Trinity College Dublin, and up until 2019 was the Medical Director of St. Patrick's Mental Health Services. Jim has over 30 years experience in clinical and academic psychiatry, and recently wrote a book entitled A Whole New Plan for Living, which is about achieving balance and wellness in a changing world. So first and foremost, Jim, we really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy man between family commitments on a Saturday morning, so thanks a million.
Thank you, Dave, for having me, and thank you to the listeners of Charity Radio.
You were saying your son or daughter is having a French oral this morning, so you're a busy household.
That's right. So the Leaving Cert orals are on now. So he's out walking around the block,
reciting some French.
Reciting some French, exactly.
Good stuff. Just for a purpose of context here and for the benefits of the listeners, Jim, can you just give us a kind of a brief overview of your own background?
Well, my background, I'm from Dublin, and I grew up in a family of 5, and I live in Dublin, not half a mile from where I grew up, and together with my wife, we're raising 5 children, and 3 of them are up and grown, and 2 of them are still with us in the house, and we've been cocooning like everybody else for the last year. 2 of the older two work in health services, and one works in she's a singer, so she sort of is in the gig economy.
Okay.
And so I'm at that phase of my life where they're really my main interest in many respects. Professionally, I'm a psychiatrist. That means I'm a medical doctor. I trained in general practice. I grew up in a general practice. My late mother was a GP when that was very unusual for someone to be what they used to call a lady doctor. My father was a civil engineer, worked in the civil service. He was the city valuer before he went on to work in the semi-states, which was then Irish Life. And, I went into medicine expecting to be a general practitioner and looking forward to that. And that's not the way the stars turn out. So I actually met an extraordinarily charismatic psychiatrist in the Mater Hospital. And Dorothy Keelan was her name, and she encouraged me to do psychiatry because it seems to fit with me, and I was happier doing it, and it just fitted. And she encouraged me to take it on. She encouraged me to go to St. Patrick's to do training there. So I trained there for a number of years, and then went to London, where I did some higher training and some research, and then we settled in London. And then when my parents became ill, we both decided to come home, really to be around them in the middle 90s.
Okay, so you cut your teeth, as they say, in London anyway, and then came back to Dublin mid-90s.
Then came back to Dublin, yeah, and that was boom time, and with all went through that, So we have sort of 2 families in a sense: a bigger family who are raised in London and a smaller family who are raised in Dublin.
Very good. Okay, good stuff. And just in terms of the book, Jim, the first time I came across you actually was about 2010 or 2011. It was in the old Stillorgan Park Hotel, which is now the Talbot Hotel. You did a talk with Jane Stevenson for seminars.ie. And I went, I suppose, with a little bit of a closed mind in terms, I assumed that it was going to be heavily, medical jargon, and it mightn't be accessible to, the normal person going along.
I remember that talk.
Yeah, it was really good, actually. And I was pleasantly surprised because I think your talk was accessible to everybody there. And it wasn't just applicable to people with serious mental illness. It was a general talk about wellness, I felt anyway. So I came out of it with a lot of learnings. And the consensus on your book seems to be the same, that it is accessible. So do you want to just maybe, I suppose, firstly, what prompted you to write the book? And you might just go into detail about it.
Well, I've been writing books for numbers of years, Dave, and I wanted to make a book that was as accessible and interesting for as wide as possible an audience, and yet that would have, I think, the curriculum or the insights of mental health that I'm so interested in and passionate about, and feel that people would benefit from. And in a way, I feel that the job of my profession is to communicate health, and I think that the job of communication is increasingly as important as diagnostics or therapeutics. So I think the profession is learning that we need to be out there communicating health and communicating the health agenda. And during COVID and the pandemic, that's become very obvious how much we have to learn in doing that, and how poor we are at that kind of communication. But there are others who are good at it, in psychology and indeed in the world of politics and economics. And so I wanted to try and bring that together. And also, I also was in lockdown, so I became quite ill actually the few months before lockdown with a chest illness, and as a result of the virus, I then had to go into cocooning. And
you yourself picked up COVID?
I didn't pick up COVID. No, I had a year before that developed pneumonia, viral pneumonia, which hospitalized me.
Oh, okay.
With a virus called our RSV, and so I'd come out of that. And then this came along, and so understandably the occupational health in my hospital said, well, you can't come in, you're
vulnerable, obviously,
you're at risk, you're at risk. And so I took cocooning very seriously from the start, on instructions, but also it made sense to me. I was on steroids and lots of medicines, so I found myself trying to work from my bedroom and continuing to work with busy clinic and all the rest. And also I was in transition because I'd left the management side of the hospital to a new team. So I was now really relearning what I had been doing 15 years earlier, which was clinical care and diagnostics and prescribing and all the rest. And so that was a huge transformation for somebody at 60 to go back and do all that again and relearn previous skills. Now, they were hardwired, I suppose, but they're now changed. So the hospital is completely computerized and so on. We were well set up for this calamity, really, which is sort of the beginning of the 21st century. But I found myself in my room wondering what I was going to do. And so in the way that we all do, I was talking to my family over Zoom and talking to my brother in America. And so he encouraged me to write a book, but he said, for heaven's sake, write one that's accessible to everyone and write a happy one.
Okay.
And that was interesting because it's sort of, it was, I think, the right direction, but it also freed me up from feeling I had to write a book that was overly academic or overly, weighty. But it also, it's very, very hard to write one that's solid and yet light.
Yeah, it's difficult to get that balance, obviously.
It's difficult to get that balance, and it's also one that it's the balance where the truth is, because if it doesn't resonate with real people, then it probably isn't real. So I wanted to. So then I decided to rock back to my own experience, and so the book became a mixture of memoir as well as first aid kit for psychology. Okay. And I then found that worked for me. I was able to tell stories of my own COVID year, retirement year, adaptation to illness year, adaptation to an expectation of the year that was ahead of us, and wrap that around ways to well-being, which of course I wanted to look at. And I suppose as a scientist, I looked and saw what evidence existed for these things. So I picked mantra, or a curriculum, as I called it, for well-being, which was well-founded in science, and only if there was data and testing to support it, rather than well-meaning stuff. It turns out that there's an awful lot of very good science around wellness and well-being. And
but it's to get that accurate data, and I suppose that's one of the kind of perceptions out there, that wellness books can be a bit flowery and lacking in concrete data. So I suppose it's important to have that. Yeah.
The difficulty is that that sense of what they're about can be more about marketing something, or it can be about people's own, if you like, particular agenda. People could be selling something, all of that. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't good books out there, but there's an awful lot of wellness and self-help there that's just outside of science. And I didn't want to do that. I couldn't do that. I read loads of them in preparation for it, and I looked at lots. And I was amazed how wide the spectrum was from reality to fantasy.
And everything in between.
And everything in between. So I wanted to try and root this in common sense and in reality and in science. So I wanted to be sensible and accessible and hopeful and helpful.
Okay, and what's the crux of it, so Jim? I mean, you talk about the 3 skills in it. Do you want to just give us kind of, I mean, maybe start off and give us a few pointers on the book? What's the nitty gritty of it, basically?
Well, the nitty gritty is that I'm asking people who've been contemplating getting well to do it in, now, today, afresh, and in fact tomorrow to do it afresh, and to do it with what I call the tools, which are a blank page, a pencil, an open mind, and a hopeful heart. So these are the 4 tools you need. It's all you need, actually. It's no use having going into this with pessimism. There's no use in going into it with a closed mind, and yet you do need some structure, and a pencil and a paper is really all you need to start with. If you've got a hopeful heart and an open mind, you can then look at the curriculum and share with me, as I was doing it, that journey, because I'm looking at wellness from a point of view of somebody who wanted to get well, wanted to stay well, perhaps was coming from medicine where we're preoccupied by illness. So I was looking at it afresh as well. So one of the premises of the book is walk with me during this journey. And, I then found 3 sort of elements of, meeting that test of the sound and the scientific and the sensible and the helpful. And they were called the 8 dimensions of health, the 5 features of recovery, which are called CHIME.
CHIME, so that you use an acronym there, obviously, CHIME, yeah?
Yes, and the 5 ways to wellness. It's interesting, they come from different places. The 8 dimensions of health comes from SAMHSA, which is the American Society for Addiction and Mental Health. CHIME comes from sociology and the Institute of Psychiatry, a lady called Mary Leamy. And the 5 ways to wellness comes from the New Economic Forum, which is a bunch of economists. So you have to have an open mind. You have to take it from every source. And they are really important. I suppose the one to emphasize in this, not to burden people too much with the book, but the one that really I think is probably most immediately accessible is CHIME. So we could go through that. CHIME stands for the features that mark out a successful recovery. We know that recovery initiatives that CHIME work.
And can I just ask one thing on that, Jim? So when you mention recovery, is this particular CHIME, is this relevant to somebody who is, say, battling depression, that's coming out of depression, or is it applicable to anyone who is trying to improve their mental health?
It's applicable to both those groups.
Okay.
We know that if you hear CHIME is, it's the C stands for connectedness, H for hope, I for identity, M for meaning and purpose, and E for empowerment. Now, if you were going to decide to do up your garden, you need to CHIME, because you need to connect with those people who are going to help you. You need to hope that it's worthwhile doing, so you'll think that you're going to get a better garden at the end of it. It needs to be your garden. I mean, there's no point in doing up your patch and saying I'm going to make it somebody else's garden. It's your patch. It has to be authentic and have integrity around yours. That's a key. Gardening has to be something that's meaningful to you. Otherwise, why are you doing it? And then you need the tools. And so we need to empower ourselves and each other. And the tool in this context for well-being includes things like self-compassion, things like the 5 ways to wellness, which we can talk about. So you absolutely can apply this to any human initiative. But without these human factors, you get what we often have, which is pessimism, hopelessness. And then the other thing, which people don't recognize, which is impulsive, setting the bar so high that we can't jump it. And then we're disappointed, we crash and fall, and we give up.
Okay, so setting a realistic goal really would be more suitable than a goal that's too high and failing.
Too high and failing is hopeless. We want to lower the bars each day and jump the hurdles every day. And then we want to go forward so that we can do something constructive every day. And ideally something we enjoy, something that fits us. The pleasure principle is a key measure of this book. The idea that we must learn to make a synergy between the things that are authentic for us and that we enjoy and that are powerful for us, and the things that are good for us and help us to carry on.
Okay.
In that sense, it's meant to be a very happy book.
Perfect. Can I just pick up on the self-compassion piece, Jim, because that's interesting. I mean, a huge amount of our days are consumed by negative thinking, and it being the complete opposite to self-compassion, you know, a destructive mind and constantly berating yourself in your head. And I know self-compassion is a theme of Buddhism, really. So are you delving into any kind of religion or spiritual aspects here?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that spirituality is part of health. And one of the three elements of the curriculum I've mentioned was the 8 dimensions of health. And it might be worth looking at those. We tend to think of health as being physical, but wonder, do we think of it also as being financial and occupational, environmental, intellectual, social, emotional, and spiritual? So it becomes those 8 things. Now, none of us manages to do those 8 things at the same time, all with the same degree of energy or success. But in restoring health, it's a bit like, you know, putting in 8 bricks in a wall. They are all there. And, you know, missing any of them makes the thing less stable and less rewarding.
It's that holistic approach, isn't it? I mean, that holistic approach.
It's a holistic human approach. I mean, I do consider in the book the nature of health and religion, and the nature of health and religion and spirituality. And it's interesting that, you know, where I come from, very much the tradition we grew up in, was founder of St. Patrick's, that we have in Ireland probably just enough religion to hate each other, but not enough to love each other. And I think it's important that we reframe our faith and our spirituality in the context of the origins of it. And so I'm very much a Christian, and it seems to me that mindfulness, compassion, self-compassion, and hope for the recovery, these are key spiritual ideas that resonate with where I come from, notwithstanding what Swift says, that we've tended to confuse religion with hating each other.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you think because a lot of younger people in particular have gone away from Catholicism for various reasons, do you think there's that void gone now that people mightn't necessarily be aware of useful teachings of a church? Do you think there's that void with younger people if they're not getting religion?
Well, I think that all of us have to mind the gap. And I think young people get a hard time. I think voids are inherent. None of us are complete. And we're all looking to fill voids. You know, you get on the tube in London and it says, mind the gap. I always like to ask people, what is the gap? Where's your gap? I don't think there's an institution in the country. And here I'm just speaking about Ireland, but of course you could apply this across the world. But there's not an institution in the country that we associate with. I'm older than you, Dave, but we associate with pillars of the country that hasn't been brought down. Whether it's the banks, or the governments, or the churches, each of them has been found to have feet of clay, and each of them has been found to deny their own, if you like, iniquity initially, a reflex action. So they first of all concealed what they were doing, then they were exposed, then they denied it. Now that cascade of concealment, exposure, and denial is very dispiriting for ordinary people, for all of us. Because it smacks of hypocrisy, and it's impossible to place your hope in institutions that behave that way. So I'm hopeful, though, and I encourage people to be hopeful, because I think the hope comes from a realignment of ourselves with our own responsibility and capacity to care for ourselves. And, you know, I mean, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, now what, you can't do that unless you are loving yourself. And so it's a very important thing, you know, to take charge of, I suppose, of your body and soul. I remember my granny used to say, you know, Jimmy, you've only one soul to save. And I suppose that's where I'd start with religion and with spirituality.
Interesting. Yeah, I've gone to a lot of talks on Buddhism, and one of the key themes seems to be kind of impermanence. And I think that's very pertinent in today's environment. Things will change eventually. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be the next day, but things are, well, I suppose things are changing all the time. And I suppose that's relevant to the COVID situation. Yeah.
I think that the idea of the transience of time, in the book, I take you through 9 and 10 steps. And by the time you get to step 9, that's a key message that, what did the mystic Julian and Orange say? All will be well and all will be very well in time. The thing is that we have to believe that everything changes. Nothing stands still. And each day is a change. Now, getting up for that in joy and in hope and in enthusiasm is hard for us when we're dashed, when we have huge losses. So one of the things I wanted to do with the book was I wanted to acknowledge the extent of those, if you like, those distresses to people. And I think that there's a tendency we can have to divide people who have somehow got stress or distress or indeed disorder from those of us who don't, without realizing that all of us will have stress. All of us will have a time of distress. And indeed, 1/5 of us will have any one particular disorder at any one time. So I think we have to be universal about this, and we then have to accept that it's a challenge to deal with loss and grief, and the particularly painful forms of loss and grief that I talk about in the book. But they also are a challenge to deal with a difficult boss. How do you deal with a relationship breakdown? How do you deal with the challenges of career and homelessness and so on and so on? And each of those I've addressed in kind of digressions from the 10 steps as a way of integrating and making it meaningful. Because I found that many of the self-help books tended to bore me because they didn't talk about those issues.
And these are relevant issues that everybody is going through, right?
Everybody's going through, but also that they're the authentic thing. Whatever you're doing, whether you're recommending sucking sunflower seeds or, as I'm doing, restarting with a blank page, it has to meet the test of real life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things you kind of alluded there is resilience. I suppose in the current climate, the climate we're living in, it's vitally important that people have that kind of store of resilience built up, because life will throw a huge amount of problems at you. And the more kind of you can educate your mind around how to deal with them, the better.
I think the important thing about resilience can't be underestimated. But what people perhaps don't realize is that resilience is something we've really only very recently been talking about in healthcare. The ability to bounce back. And even then, it's been talked about as though it was somehow the responsibility of others to deal with it. Whereas actually, resilience comes from the great work of Michael Rutter, who now, a very elderly man, is considered the father of child psychiatry. And he looked at the nature of resilience because of his own experience in the Second World War, where he was evacuated across the North Atlantic Sea during the U-boat war as a 12-year-old. And he never forgot the experience of that terror. I mean, the ships were going down around them. It was a nightmare. He got to New York and he lived his life there and went on to become an extraordinary man. But resilience and the difference between those who seemed to be able to bounce back and those who couldn't became the basis of his life's work. And he found that things like education, a security of base, knowing who you were, positive values, friendships, talents and interests, these were the things that actually made us resilient. It's not some
built up your resilience. It's not one magic wand.
So
it's a combination of things.
Well, making that call today to that friend is a resilient move. Deciding to get out that piece of paper. So I would encourage your listeners to get out the piece of paper and put on the top of it their name, because I think we are talking about our well-being to start with. We then want an idea of whole of health, which is your well-being, and then our family's well-being, our neighborhood's well-being, the world's well-being, our people and our animals and animal life's well-being. But we start with us, okay? So to get to a one whole of health idea, you start with this health. Write your name at the top of it. And then if you write your name at the top of it, say things like, who am I? What am I about? Who do I love? How do I love? How do I want to go on today or tomorrow? Ask yourself the question. You might say, God, I don't want to do that. Well, this is something you can do on your own. It's something you're doing anyway. Make it explicit and write it down. And I usually encourage people to say, don't worry if you haven't the answers today, but draw a large circle in the middle of the page. And into that circle, put your identity. And now we're going to put around it the challenges, the losses, the difficulties. And soon, out of a page, we can conjure a real, meaningful way forward. Indeed, a whole new plan for living. And that the book tells you, in a way, how I try to do that using that method.
So you're getting the reader involved as they go on, as opposed to it being prescriptive and telling them what to do.
Oh, I don't know what your prescription is at all.
Yeah.
I didn't know and don't know what mine is. But it's a work of art. Your life is a work of art, and it's a work of art that we need to make external in order to address the internal. And if we don't do that, we're postponing the day when it has to be done. And the day when it has to be done is really when we're over. And it starts with my father's death. And I found myself going back to this time 20 years ago when I had to tell him of his last illness. He had a dementia, which was a dementia called frontotemporal dementia. It's not often talked about. And so I had to tell him. And in response to it, he said, well, Jimmy, if what you tell me is true, there's something I need you to do for me. And I said, what is that, Dad? And he said, pushing a piece of paper and a pencil towards me, he said, I need you to give me a whole new plan for living.
Excellent. Okay.
And yeah. I went out with tears in my eyes and a well of emotion in my heart, saying, how can I give him a whole new plan for living? But isn't it amazing? He's asking me, even now when we're talking about his death, to talk about a new life.
Okay, so a timely tribute to your father, Jim, obviously, yeah?
It was, yeah.
Okay, well, excellent. I really appreciate your time. And I know the listeners, there is Mountains to Sea Festival tomorrow, right, at 12 o'clock. And are you speaking at that, Jim?
I am indeed. And hopefully people enjoy that conversation.
Great. So it's mountainstosea.ie, I think is the website. Yeah, they can buy tickets on it. Okay, look, really appreciate your time. I know it's a Saturday morning and your kids are up to high dough with the leave insert. So really appreciate your time. Thanks again, Jim. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David, for having me. And thank you to Charity Radio.
Thank you very much. Thank you.